Cultic is a fast-paced, crunchy, grimy horror shooter with killer gameplay, graphics, style and music. There are only a few games that pull this off, especially in this format. This genre has seen a resurgence in the last few years, with many indie developers making unique FPS experiences, which are all a blast to play. But Cultic really stands out for me. It reminds me of one of my favorite games. Jason Smith, the solo developer of the game, was kind enough to answer some questions about the game and its relation to RE4 and other inspirations. But to give you a good picture on why Cultic feels like a spiritual successor to Resident Evil 4, to me,
I will tell you the story of my birth.
I grew up playing games on Steam. From a very young age I was obsessed with games like Half-Life, Portal, Left 4 Dead, and almost anything Valve made. To this day I still believe Valve is one of the best game developers out there. Collecting games on Steam became a bit of an addiction for me. Eventually I accumulated a collection of about 400 plus games on there, which really didn't stop growing with all those Steam sales. Though as a PC gamer, I always wanted to see those games physically, lining up shelves like books. I eventually left the PC gaming scene and started playing a lot more single-player focused games on console. Trophy hunting even became a little second gaming hobby of mine. But yeah, I grew up with PC games. Before Steam, I always played games from discs or other means. Games like Max Payne and Fear really shaped my taste for focused single-player adventures. I soon got my hands on the original 1998 Half-Life, which completely took over my small world. Gordon Freeman and the G-Men were all I could think about for a long time. I played the base game and its expansions Blue Shift and Opposing Force countless times, and of course its phenomenal sequel and extra parts. The amount of phenomenal mods I've played in the Gold Source engine is monumental. Afraid of Monsters, Die Hunger, Cry of Fear, which introduced me to Silent Hill before I even knew it. Half-Life really got its claws in me and stuck with me so well not only because of its great setting and gameplay, but because of its unique unsettling aesthetic and atmosphere. Valve always knew how to build a sense of unease in all of its games. The G-Man sightings throughout the Half-Life franchise, the Redman dance in the Portal games, hell, the whole Ravenholm sequence in Half-Life 2. These small pockets of horror were scattered throughout these games, waiting to give you this unsettling, uncanny valley feeling. It was obvious Half-Life had this effect on many people as well, with most of the best received mods fitting in the horror genre. This was years before I became such a huge fan of the whole genre. Years later I played Resident Evil 4, and that was it for me. I was about 15 years old when Resident Evil 4 released on Steam. By that time I had dabbled in the Resident Evil franchise here and there. My first encounter was, funny enough, the Umbrella Chronicles on the Nintendo Wii. A rail shooter that blew my 9-year-old socks off. I always knew of Resident Evil's existence and mostly played the games that were available to me. For all of its faults, I even got completely addicted to Resident Evil 6 when it released in 2012. And it was my first real introduction to the franchise and its characters. The game's Mercenaries mode was just insanely fun, and they even had Left 4 Dead characters in the Steam version. In my previous video I've talked at length on why I find Resident Evil 4 to be such a perfect game in terms of setting and environment. A lot of why the game works so well I feel is because it's so disconnected from the whole franchise up until that point. The whole series dealt with Umbrella and Raccoon City for so long, it was mostly the only thing going for it. RE4 threw all that aside. The game's introduction literally writes Umbrella off, opening the door for new creativity.
Soon its stock prices crashed, and for all intents and purposes, Umbrella was finished.
One of the main reasons RE4 just really hits the spot for me is the cult. This creepy guy completely alone in this hostile environment with crazed fanatics out for his blood is a concept that just can't go wrong in my book. I don't really know why it's such a perfect idea for me, but I've been chasing the high ever since I first played Resident Evil 4. Even the sequel, which plays very much the same in terms of pacing and gameplay, can't quite scratch the itch, and I think no game has ever really gotten me close to that first RE4 playthrough. That is, until Cultic. Cultic scratches that itch. This perfect little shooter made by one-man studio Jessel's Games recaptured the magic I felt playing Resident Evil 4 for the first time. It even has a little Mauser as your first gun. Can be a coincidence, right? Well, it's not. Jason Smith references his huge love and influence for RE4 on social media often. When asked about the inclusion of the C96, he had this to say. I've always been a fan of the Mauser since seeing it as Han Solo's blaster in Star Wars as a kid, but it's definitely my favorite weapon in RE4, so including it as the standard pistol was a no-brainer. Most people playing Cultic seem to call back to 1997's Blood, an old first-person shooter in which you play an undead gunslinger named Caleb, fighting cultists and demons. The game features a lot of occult and horror themes, as does 2022's Cultic. Most of the direct influence from Blood came from Caleb's TNT weapon and its engine's aesthetic, the build engine, which were also used in games like Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior, though Cultic's main inspiration comes from RE4 and surprisingly Star Wars Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, primarily because of its level design and use of secret hunting, which is also a returning factor in Cultic. I asked Jason how he dealt with the Blood comparisons, which are unmissable wherever you go. I generally don't mind the comparisons to Blood, because most often people are doing it in a good way. They love Blood, this reminds them of it, and so they play Cultic. What is more frustrating is when people hear someone say that Cultic is the real Blood too, or something similar, and as die-hard fans of Blood, they then can't go into Cultic with an open mind, and are critical of everything it does differently from Blood, which is a lot. They are very different games. As someone who never got very far while playing Blood, it's a very hard game, I'm sorry. Cultic reminded me of a game I hold very dear. It eventually comes down to the details on the surface. Compared to Resident Evil 4, Cultic is a whole different beast. A fast-paced, mind-blowing, kick-ass, crunchy FPS compared to a pretty slow and methodical survival horror game. But that's just it. When creating Cultic's combat loop, one of the most important factors Jason wanted to bring into his own game were RE4's deep and methodical combat systems. There's very little RNG nonsense or cheap tricks there. Enemies have clear telegraphs, consistent behaviors, and you can really learn the combat and become proficient in it. As Jason points out, many other games have very chaotic enemies with no clear attack patterns. This isn't the case for Resident Evil 4 and Cultic. This design philosophy is apparent especially in the cultist enemies. As an example, who play clear global audio cues when they're about to attack. Give the player time to respond, and then have consistent shot timings and cooldowns so you can learn their patterns and plan your counter-attack. The combat feels a lot like Resident Evil 4 for a reason. Jason made sure to bring a lot of the same mechanics and core elements found in RE4's gameplay loop back in his own game. The game spares no moments to throw you straight into the action from the get-go. In the first few minutes you'll be chopping, shooting and blowing up rope figures with an arsenal of classic weapons. This is one of the first few RE4 itches Cultic scratches for me. Old antique weapons are cool. Jason, the Chad wood furniture on guns enjoyer, wanted to explore some less frequently used mid-century guns to use in his game, to find some cool looking weapons to match Cultic's grimy aesthetic. Little details go a long way. The lever action rifle, which works as your high damage magnum, is one of the most satisfying weapons in the game. Racking new rounds after every successful kill makes you feel like a real gunslinger, even when you miss half your shots. The alternate fire, which all guns have, shoots round in quick succession, holding the gun a little sideways while doing so. The game eventually tells you that while holding out a lighter in dark areas you can only use single-handed weapons. Your first reaction, probably like mine, is to grab your pistol or hatchet. You don't have any other weapons in your arsenal that you can use with one hand, right? Well, you're wrong. Holding out the rifle with one hand not only allows you to use one of the strongest weapons in the game while using the lighter, it also has a unique wrecking animation. Holy f***. There's a certain strength in making the player feel cool while playing the game. Resident Evil 4 is one of the best games to do this, and Cultic is exceedingly close. Next to an amazing selection of weapons, Jason filled his game with some of the most satisfying, crunchy sound effects that you can wish for. Headshots haven't been this satisfying since, well, Resident Evil 4. This crunchiness, if that's what we're calling it, continues into every fiber of the game. Not only in its impeccable sound design, but also in its overall look. Every object, texture and every skybox looks deep-fried. If you told someone purely on looks that this game released alongside some early PS1 horror games, they will believe you. But that doesn't hold the game back from wowing you sometimes. Which takes me to my second point. Style. Here I am once again talking about locations, but it's definitely something that always piques my interest. The game primarily takes place in a forest environment far from any civilization. The town that you do stumble upon even has a story to tell as to why there are no friendly faces greeting an officer of the law. If you're not blasting your way through heavily wooded areas, you'll be doing exactly that in ancient churches, dark catacombs, caves and abandoned buildings. The game consistently nails the horror aesthetic in every level and even pops up small references to other horror media here and there. Cultic has no trouble making you feel like Ash in Army of Darkness 1 minute, and like Ashley in The Evil Dead the next. The first real carpet the game pulls from under you is your first encounter with the Harvester, another big RE4 influence. This version of Dr. Salvador pulls all the punches. After demolishing a significant number of the cult forces, while the fittingly titled track Unstoppable plays, the music dies down and throws you down a dark cavern filled with bodies. The game instructs you how to use the lighter, and the only sound you hear are your muddied footsteps and the sound of flies and rotting corpses. You soon find body bags hanging from the ceiling and bear traps leading you to a small retreat in the back of the cavern. After grabbing the key, the game pulls the carpet. The game walks a line from killer action game one moment to extreme survival horror the next gracefully. Almost all these moments surprise you and leave a lasting impression. My favorite one being at the start of the third level, the mine town. I won't go into detail and just show you some more gameplay. My first reaction while playing this part was a real bafflement that there were some actual honest-to-God zombies in the game. Strange for a game like this, I know. Which brings me to my next itch, the surprisingly big amount of iconic moving targets, that being enemies. You'll encounter enemies like robed cultists with different weaponry, cultists with shields, big cultists with big weapons, chainsaw-wielding madmen in animated suits of armor. Wait a minute. Once again, the influence is undeniable. Jason stated that a lot of the enemies are pretty transparently inspired by its Resident Evil counterparts. One of the more tankier enemies even, the Adept, was inspired by the likes of Metal Slug's 5, Occult Army. Some other inspirations would include the Tulemiac elite special forces from Metal Slug for the adept gas mask cultist. I've always loved the trope of gas mask special forces, whether it's from Metal Slug or Hunk from Resident Evil, so having a more agile, tanky and cunning enemy with a titular gas mask was an easy add. But it doesn't stop Cultic from going the extra mile. Next to these familiar faces, the game goes further into the weird and occult. Zombies, big-mouthed, literal reanimated skeletons and telekinetic ghosts fill the extensive list of people and things that have it in for you. Jason even has a pretty interesting story to tell you about that final enemy. The ghost enemy is actually inspired by a reoccurring nightmare I had when I was younger, of a silent, unmoving, bedsheet ghost-looking creature with rust stains that would observe me from the trees and in the distance. Really unsettling stuff, and no idea where that came from. The cult even sends an honest-to-god tank your way in an effort to demolish you. This tank is considered one of the 2 boss fights in the game, which are both pretty impressive and require more thought the higher the difficulty you play on. If it wasn't mind-boggling enough that one guy did the art, coded, did the game and level design and even did the crunchy perfect sound design, wait till you hear who scored it. You have a guess? Well, if you've been looking at the soundtrack pop-ups, you might have an idea. Yeah, it's the same guy. The soundtrack carries the same iconic crunch factor you see in every piece of the game, and does so varyingly with big epic soundscapes like its final boss music and dark foreboding tracks like 4's of Rot. Even the soundtrack is reminiscent of RE4 and sometimes even Silent Hill, once again putting a graceful balancing act between off-putting horror and empowering badassery. Jason states that some of the biggest influences to the game's OST would be Super Metroid, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and primarily the track The Port of Adia from Turok 2. Some of these tracks even flawlessly blend into shit your pants scared to shit their pants scared. What? One minute narrowly surviving your way through an area that even the cult is too scared to enter, the next blasting your way through the undead with a new rifle and the promise of safety in sight. Cultic is a different game than Resident Evil 4 for sure. It's a different genre, it's spaced way faster, plays more akin to classic shooters like Doom and Quake. It has no quippy blonde menace and no...
Thank you.
Somehow though, Jason perfectly captured RE4's essence and put it in his own perfect creation. Its style, its music, its design and overall atmosphere is undeniably original. It's been hammered on quite a bit already, but of course, Resident Evil 4 is near the top of my list for all-time favorites. Super Metroid is probably one spot above it though. In general, I get really into horror gaming and enjoy lots of ghost hunting with friends in Phasmophobia, skulking around the Ishimura and Dead Space, and have a soft spot for the indie gem Cry of Fear. This is what happens when one person creates something so unique, so perfect, it influences people, opening the gates for more creativity, more amazing experiences that others can enjoy and relate to. Cultic is heavily inspired by other media, but that doesn't mean it's not original. It makes it even better. And in time, games like Cultic will influence new people to create their little masterpiece. It influenced me to make this video, and maybe my video will influence you to make yours. Jason is currently working on Cultic Chapter 2, which by the look of the stuff he's sharing on social media right now, is going to be one hell of a DLC. Be sure to check out this game, I promise you, you will not be disappointed. It will blow your socks off. thanks for watching. I just want to thank you guys for sticking around and watching the first video so many times. It was insane to see that blow up as a first video. So thank you truly for that. And please check out Jason's game. He does it all by himself, as you've noticed in the video, but you should really check it out. It's really good. If you like Resident Evil, you'll probably like this. So it's on Steam. It's, I think, like $10. Get it. It's good. Okay. Thanks again. See you later.